I'm very pleased and honored to be joined by Wright. Wright is a Pulitzer Prize winner for his book, The Looming Tower, of course a longtime writer for The New Yorker, the author of 2 one-man plays, correct, and a Dallas native, also the author of In the New World, which is a memoir largely about growing up in Dallas. This session is co-presented by the 6th Floor Museum. Ladies and gentlemen, Lawrence Wright.
Thank you.
So your new book, which isn't out yet, as we were just talking about, is The Terror Years, and it's a collection of pieces largely from The New Yorker.
That's correct.
Some material from the Looming Tower as well, and you've gone back and as you can do when you write a book, you've gone back and done some addition and some editing and whatnot. So I want to just start talking about your background in that part of the world, in the Middle East. And I understand it started back during the Vietnam War.
That's right.
When you found yourself in Egypt.
Can you all hear me okay? All right. I was a conscientious objector during Vietnam. And I never expected that I would be granted out of Dallas, Texas, a conscientious objector exemption. But I had to require, you had to do 2 years of alternative service. And it had to be 50 miles from home. And that was all right with me, because America at that time was just being torn apart. Culturally, our family was at war with each other, and I just wanted to get as far out of town as I could. It had to pay very little, and it had to be in the service nominally of the United States. So I went to the United Nations thinking that they would give me a low-paying job somewhere far, far away. And they said, no, we don't do that. But here's a list of American institutions abroad. And I looked at the list, and one of them, the American University in Cairo, had an office across the street at 866 UN Plaza. There are times in your life when, your life is going to change and you don't really know. I walked across the street not knowing that my entire future life was going to be completely different. And I didn't know, for instance, that we didn't have any diplomatic relations with Egypt at the time. And there were only about 200 Americans in the whole country. I'm not even sure that I knew what language they spoke in Egypt. I didn't know anything. I just, and so half an hour after I entered the office, they said, "Can you leave tonight?" No, I can't leave tonight. My girlfriend's back in Boston. I haven't told my parents what I'm doing. And, "Can you leave tomorrow?" "Yeah, I can go tomorrow." So I went back to Boston, where I was living with now my wife, and said, I don't know where this leaves us, but I'm going to Cairo. And I called my parents from JFK the next morning. I flew to Cairo, landed some midnight, something like that, taught my first class at 9 the next morning. And the class was for kids whose language ability wasn't quite good enough to get into the university. And there were 14 levels of descending ability, and I had 13 and 14. And I walked into 14, and my first words as a teacher, "Can anybody here speak English?" And someone said, "You do." This was my triumphant entry. That's how I got involved in the Middle East. And it honestly was, I loved my time there. Egypt was a different place. None of my young women students was covered at the time. In fact, even at Cairo University, it was rare to see a woman in hijab. It was rare to see the prayer mark, except when Sadat became president. We were there when Nasser died, and he had this called Zabiba, the raisin, that little mark from prostrating your head on the prayer mat for hour after hour. It was considered low class, unusual. It was fun-loving society for the most part. Egyptians love jokes. I love jokes. I love my students. You go back to Cairo now, it's a very different place. And, it changed in some good ways, but I regret the ways in which, religion has taken hold in such a stringent and sometimes dangerous fashion.
And then you begin working on the Looming Tower shortly after 9/11, correct?
On 9/11, at the time I was in Austin, and I was thinking of transitioning away from journalism. I was going to be a movie director, and I was writing scripts for me to direct. And so 9/11 happened. If you remember, the planes were grounded, and I couldn't get to New York. And even the phones at the New Yorker, or all over New York, were out for a while. But I sent an email to the editor, David Remnick. I said, put me to work. And we had a conference call when the phones came back on that afternoon. And there were New Yorker writers scattered all around the country. They were often on assignment. Jeff Toobin was in San Francisco, and Jane Mayer and Jeff Goldberg were both in Washington. And you could hear them, the sirens in the background. The ambulances headed to the Pentagon, and Remnick's assignment for us was to interview people that we thought would be useful, send him, whatever we could get. And he was going to put it together in some kind of coherent story. And I was fortunate to find this young man named Kurt Yeltsin, who was a reporter for an investment magazine I'd never heard of called Waters. And he was in New York, and he had an appointment on the 110th floor in Windows on the World, in the World Trade Center, at 9 that morning. And he slept through his subway stop, the first time it had ever happened to him. And he was frantic, and he was running late. Fortunately, Kurt had a photographic memory, too. But in talking to him, he's a person in trauma. And he talked about how in this kind of eerie, high voice that you sometimes hear when people are, in a state of shock. He was talking about how he'd gotten around to the next station and got on the next subway, ran into the Trade Center. The Trade Center had escalators going up to the elevator bank, so it was a little unusual. The ground floor was not where the elevators were. So he went up and got on the elevator and was looking at his watch, and there was the elevator operator was, he said, like a big black guy, like a linebacker, played in college or something like that. And Kurt was real angry because he held the door for this rather well put together business lady who was taking her sweet time walking across the lobby. And just as she stepped into the elevator, Kurt noticed that she had a rose tattoo on her ankle. And the phrase, "oh wow," was in his mind when the plane hit. And they didn't know what it was. It felt like a little earthquake. The elevator doors sort of accordioned, and then he walked out, and he said it was very strange because he looked around and there were things on the floor, and it turned, like it was cement and plaster, but they were objects the size of a clock radio or a desk chair, and that was odd. And he was disoriented, and remember, he thought that he was walking outside, but he was actually going to a plaza that was above the street level. He walked out, and the first thing he saw were hundreds of shoes. And then he saw what looked like luggage, but he realized it was torsos. And Anyway, his story, over the next 2 days, I was interviewing him. My wife was typing up and that became the bookend for the famous black issue of the New Yorker. And after that, I just started looking for obituaries that were streaming online. I was still stuck in Austin, but trying to find a way to, because I had lived in Egypt, I spoke some Arabic, I lived in a Muslim country. I had written this movie called The Siege that was in creepy ways premonitory. It was about what would happen if terrorism came to New York. And all of those things impelled me to decide I'm going to write about this. It was more of a mission than just an article.
One of the remarkable things about reading through the Terror Years, which I should say we'll publish in August, you kind of get the sensation of living through these last 15 very crazy years as you go through these pieces. So I want to talk about a few of those pieces in particular that really struck me. One is called The Counterterrorist. And this is the story of John O'Neill, and you describe it as almost like a Greek tragedy in a sense. What can you tell us about John O'Neill's tale?
Well, when I said I was looking through the obituaries that were streaming online, figuring when you have a massive tragedy like this, the challenge to a writer is how do you make it human? How do you bring it down to the level that people can relate to? And for me, it's about writing about individuals. And I call them donkeys. It sounds like a derogatory term. I don't mean it that way. A donkey is a very useful beast of burden. He can take the reader into a world that he's never been in, and he can carry a lot of information on his back. It's different from a magazine profile in which, the personality is all you're writing about, and it's somebody glamorous or interesting. But a donkey is different. It's a person who is a vehicle for the reader to enter this other world. And John O'Neill, I looked on the Washington Post site, and one of the fatalities was the guy, John O'Neill, who had been head of counterterrorism for the FBI in New York. And I knew immediately what that meant because I had written about that same department in The Siege. Denzel Washington plays the role that John O'Neill actually occupied. And he was the man who was supposed to get bin Laden. And instead, bin Laden got him. So I thought at the time he had been washed out of the Bureau because he had taken classified information out, and then he had taken a job as the head of security at the World Trade Center. And at the time I thought, how ironic, but I don't think that it was irony. His friend said, "You'll be safe now, John. They already struck the World Trade Center because they remember they had bombed the Trade Center in '93. And he said, no, they'll come back to finish the job. So he instinctively put himself at ground zero.
It's a chilling story. It's a great story.
Well,
I remember reading it in the magazine at the time. And
I thought, I didn't know who he was, but I found out he was one of the most amazing characters in good and bad ways. I mean, there were 3 women that I've interviewed who thought that they were engaged to be married to him. And he was actually married and had 2 children in New Jersey, and they all met at his funeral. It has to be the world's worst funeral,
Controversy at the funeral.
Yeah.
One of the other pieces, which actually does something very similar to your donkey description, where you have somebody as the beast of burden, sort of the through line character is the man behind bin Laden, which is, again, one of the longer pieces in this collection, and really opened my eyes to a lot of the things happening in Egypt and in the Middle East in general. And this is the story of Ayman al-Zawahiri.
Zawahiri,
Thank
good,
you.
yeah.
Oh, actually got it right.
Yeah.
Can't believe it. And you sort of chart his his path to radical Islam and where it started when he was a teenager and how it led him to bin Laden. What can you tell us about
You know, that was the second story that I did in the 9/11, working on the Looming Tower. The Saudis wouldn't let me in for the longest time, and I thought, well, who can I write about? And well, the number 2 man is Ayman al-Zawahiri, and he was Egyptian, and I knew Egypt pretty well. And I thought, well, almost as a placeholder, I will go to Egypt and find out about Zawahiri. Well, what I learned, too, is that Al-Qaeda really was an Egyptian organization. It had a Saudi head on it, but it was essentially Zawahiri's organization. And he was, he'd been radicalized really when he created an underground cell to overthrow the Egyptian government. He was 15 years old. And I got a real appreciation for the nature of the enemy and the commitment. And I also, as much as I thought I knew about Egypt and Islam and so on, I didn't understand the depth of the alienation and the radicalization, some of which had taken place while I was there. But we were there when Sadat let the Muslim Brothers out of prison. Nasser had rounded them up after they tried to assassinate him, and imprisoned the leadership. And we never know exactly how many people are imprisoned in Egypt. But Sadat came in with the idea that he was the believing president. He called himself the first man of Islam, and therefore he would be immune to this kind of radicalism. But he did not appreciate the degree to which, especially the young people inside those prisons, had taken the radicalism a huge step further.
And then you get the sense that he goes into prison one man, and then he's tortured, and he has.
Torture was a very formative influence in terms of creating the radicalism that led to Al-Qaeda. I'm stopping myself on telling you some of the forms of torture, but there was a degree of humiliation that is unimaginable. And Zawahiri was a surgeon, a medical doctor, a distinguished, comes from both sides of his family, very distinguished figures in Egyptian society, and to be taken down that level and so abused. These men would spend a lot of times in a cell, a mass holding cell with maybe as many people as this. And they would have these conversations for years about, how do we change this? What are we going to do when we get out? And they radicalized each other, and it got deeper and deeper, and it became the most dangerous thing about Egypt at the time were the people that were in prison, and they would soon be let out. And then when that happened, Al-Qaeda really was born.
So I didn't mention at the top that you, of course, also wrote Going Clear,
Yeah.
the Prison of Belief about Church of Scientology. So I have to ask, more dangerous covering Al-Qaeda or covering Scientology?
My wife was always in the latter camp, that it was Scientology. I said, Roberta, Al-Qaeda, they cut off your head, and Scientology, they just take your house. It was, Scientology is legal threats, innumerable legal threats, and now they're writing a book about me. Boy, that's going to be compelling. But there's a reporter / private investigator that I don't see him here, but he follows me around sometimes to public events, and apparently has been talking to some of my colleagues and friends, but they're free to do that. I can't imagine that it's going to be a big seller. But it's mainly for the Scientology magazine. Freedom magazine is going to excerpt it. But I know what it's going to be. Alex Gibney, who directed it, the documentary, has a documentarian following him around doing similar kind of thing. But if you deal with the Church of Scientology, you have to know that they will retaliate and try to intimidate you. But if you're not intimidated, it doesn't work. That's the secret to all this is don't be intimidated. And I just, I as a reporter, I sometimes go to dangerous places and talk to people with blood on their hands and so on. And my philosophy is just don't think about it, because the fears you create for yourself are oftentimes worse than the actual. And if you actually let these things stand in your way, then you never get the story.
One of the other things that brings you to your native land and with us today, you are giving an oral history to the Sixth Floor Museum about being in Dallas as a 16-year-old when JFK was assassinated.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what kinds of memories and images and thoughts this has provoked within you today, and just what you can tell us about that.
Well, I came back for the 50th to make a talk. City thought very wisely decided to commemorate that and acknowledge what had happened here. I started, it was 20 years after the Kennedy assassination. I was working for the Texas Monthly, and I thought, nobody's ever written about what it was like to be here and be from here afterwards. And honestly, Dallas at the time had a really impoverished literature. There was nothing. There was a Warren Leslie book, Dallas Public and Private, that had been written after the assassination. But as a young, aspiring writer, I'd always wished I'd grown up in Paris or Brooklyn or someplace that had a shelf full of books that would tell me who I am. And when I started this project, that shelf was pretty bare, and so I felt that I was writing. I wasn't a part of a tradition. I was just writing about what it was like to have been here, and it touched a chord with a lot of people whose lives hadn't been acknowledged in that way. For me, Dallas was at that time a rather dangerous place. It was, the brakes were off. It was politically unbalanced, and it was strange because we had this super piety. We had the largest Baptist church in the world, largest Presbyterian church, one of the largest, all of these super churches, and yet also the highest, at the time we were the murder capital of the country. We had the highest rate of divorce. There are all these things that didn't really add up. So there was a paradox. And paradox was, speaking of that, the idea that there was somebody who was in Dallas who was a Marxist, Lee Harvey Oswald. I didn't even know there were Democrats. The idea that, that Dallas killed Kennedy when, the person least like Dallas you could imagine was the actual assassin. That was something that was part of the paradox. If Dallas killed anybody, my contention is that we killed Oswald. I remember my father and one of my sisters went to church that morning, Sunday after the assassination, and Mother and I stayed home to watch TV. And like a lot of Americans, we were in a trance. This endless, in fact, noted by psychologists during that time, people stopped dreaming. during that whole pageant of television, because the imagery from TV was so dominant that there was no room for dreaming. And so we were planted in front of the TV, and Daddy and Kathleen went to the service at the First Methodist, and then Pastor Robert Goodrich was giving a sermon about the climate. And he was a subtle man, but this was an indictment. He talked about how during the summer, when football players in Texas were in training, some mysterious inversion took place. And a number of football players died. One at SMU, one maybe at Texas Tech. There were 4 or 5. It was remarked at the time, a strange climate had affected the state and taken these young lives. And then he extended that to the political climate in Dallas. And my father just bristled, that here was his friend, blaming Dallas for the, and as the sermon concluded, one of the assistant ministers came out to the pulpit and handed a note to Dr. Goodrich, and Dr. Goodrich said, Lee Harvey Oswald has been shot. Well, Mother and I were watching it on TV. It was, the first murder on TV, I guess, and Oswald, and Jack Ruby said that he had done it for Dallas and for Jackie and the kids. So I think it would be an unfair charge to say that Dallas killed Kennedy, but completely fair to say that we killed Oswald. And I mourn the fact that Kennedy died. But if he had to die, I'm glad he died here, because I think it made a better city of Dallas. It made it more open and tolerant. It went through a period of deep humiliation. I mean, Dallas was taken down like no other city in America ever was. And there were assassinations, in L.A. and in Memphis. George Wallace was shot in Maryland. None of those places endured any of the kind of cultural ramifications that Dallas did. But I think that Dallas is a far better city for having endured that.
You were telling me earlier about the piece that your editor wants you to do next week. Are you at liberty to discuss that?
Yeah, I'll tell you what it is.
And then we'll open it up. Yes, please tell us what you're going to be doing.
My editor, David Remnick, I went in to talk to him. He said, Larry, would you explain Texas? I got a lot of explaining to do, but Texas has always had people parachuting in to explain Texas, and usually with an amused sneer on their faces. And I've had mixed feelings about Texas all my life, but I'm still here, and I don't know why. It's so that I thought it's a good opportunity to explore exactly what is it about this place. I mean, people come to Texas for opportunities. My dad was a small-town banker, and he got the chance to be a banker in Abilene, Texas, and then got to be president of this little bank. It was at the time called Lakewood State Bank, and in Lakewood. And it was between Doc Harrell's drugstore and Kirk's Beauty Salon. And now it's this big tower, it's a Wells Fargo, but he built that. And Dallas gave him that chance. So that's why people come, but why people stay is kind of a different, and my friend Steve Harrigan, a great novelist and dear friend, we were talking about this the other day, and he said it's subtle. And I said, it's really subtle. But, there are things about Texas that, for one thing, is home. And, you can't take that anywhere else. And with the other day, my daughter is a painter, and she's getting a MFA from the Art Institute in Chicago. And, how are things going? Well, nobody can dance, she said. And she's a wonderful dancer. And I said I'd just been down to the state capitol where the Sweetwater JCs had let out a dozen rattlesnakes on the rotunda. and she said, "Oh, I love Texas." How am I going to communicate the sincerity of that response? That's my challenge.
We look forward to the results.